Thank you very much, David. I'll begin by apologising that I'm not going to talk on the Dutch Neolithic. Instead, you've got Bronze Age Britain. And this hastily cobbled together presentation will be presenting some of my work that I conducted during my PhD, which was funded by the AHRC and undertaken at the University of Exeter. And I looked specifically at the phenomenon of the deliberate destruction and deposition of metalwork prior to being put in the ground, and what that meant to the societies that were undertaking these practices, and what we can infer about society at this time. I've slightly updated my PhD remit by incorporating some of my more recent research that I've been undertaking here at the National Museum of Scotland, so plenty of Scottish examples littered throughout. Anyone who's ever heard a talk on Bronze Age hoards before will know that it is an exhausted topic. People have been analysing Bronze Age hoards, Bronze Age depositions of metalwork for over 200 years, and generally they fall into two camps. Either this is a symbolic votive offering offered to the gods, or it is a more mundane functionalist deposit where people are gathering scraps for either for storage or for abandonment. And it's because of this that when hoards such as the collection of hoards that came up recently from Havering in London, the mass media comes back with baffling hoards. The idea that archaeologists are constantly perplexed by this mysterious phenomenon, because when asked why did they do it, the best answer we can give is, we have no idea. And this was very much apparent to me when I undertook my PhD. I wanted to engage with why was this done, who was doing it, what was it all for, what was the meaning of life in the Bronze Age. But one thing that became quickly apparent to me was that when we're looking at these hoards and depositions, often what we're seeing is fragments of objects. You might see bent and broken swords thrown in rivers, scraps of axes buried in random fields that we're still not sure what they're doing there. And accompanied with that is assumptions about how this material ended up in that state. So a bent and broken sword thrown in a river is described as having been snapped over a knee and thrown in as part of a ritual offering, whilst fragments of axes found in fields broke through use because they're presumed to have a functionalist, a fairly basic function as a tool. Nobody has ever tried to explore how you break these things. And that was kind of the fundamental approach that I took with this research. And one of the ways that I like to explore this topic is through thinking about what destruction and deposition means to us in a modern society, all the different ways that we approach this, all the different reasons that we do this. So when we have a fragment of an axe found in a field, I'm a firm believer that there's a underlying social reason for this. We just need to get at it. And one of the ways that I think we can do this is by thinking about all the various things that accompany destruction and deposition in the modern day. So we can think, for instance, about smashing a glass at a wedding. This is a fairly symbolic act. It's meant to communicate, it's meant to be undertaken for good luck. It's also meant to communicate the fragility of a relationship and the fact that you need to be careful with it. On top of that, it's an act that's designed to be seen. It's an act that people want to hear the sound of the glass breaking. People cheer when it's done. So there's a whole load of things wrapped up in this very simple act of destruction. And actually the resulting fragments become fairly meaningless afterwards, but the process of destruction is important. On the other hand, some processes of destruction are pure anarchy. Some of you may have heard this story from a couple of years ago where the Banksy painting Girl with Red Balloon was sold at auction for a rather sizable sum of money, and no sooner had the auctioneer banged down the gavel did a shredder activate in the base of the frame, and the picture started feeding through it, purely for a political statement from Banksy. To add to this story, the shredder broke halfway through this picture. So you have a half-destroyed picture that instantly quadrupled in value, and people thought that the purchaser got a rather good deal. So here we can see how destruction actually can add value to something. When turning now towards the idea of deposition in the modern day, perhaps the most common form of deposition is the burial of bodies, and this is, as we all know, of a heavily socially formed act. We subscribe to religious beliefs or ideologies surrounding how and why people should be buried. This is no different in prehistory, and I'm not going to dwell too much on convincing you of this analogy. But it's, again, an important performance that people want to see and be part of and feel. A slightly off-the-wall depositional act, one that you might not immediately come to mind, is this idea of love locks. This is the practice of going to a bridge, going to a fence, and securing a padlock on a bridge to secure your relationship as a symbol of your relationship, and upon this you throw the key in the river or discard the key afterwards. Archaeologically, what we would find is a whole bunch of padlocks and a whole bunch of keys, but as you can see from this bridge, this is the result of multiple people visiting the same spot over and over again and adding to this deposition and forming something that will completely baffle future archaeologists, as we can probably have no idea whether this was done all at once or over many, many years. And finally, perhaps my favourite example of modern deposition is time capsules. Time capsules are an act of us preserving our present for the future. We decide what we collect. It's a very selective practice. It's often a communal practice. And these places will be marked, they'll be remembered, they'll be preserved for the future. And it really, I think, brings home the idea of a communal deposit. And I actually added this in just this afternoon because I went for a trip down to the Lake District over the weekend, and I stumbled across this stone circle with a time capsule buried beneath it, the whole thing constructed at the turn of the millennium. I cannot find any information about what was buried in this time capsule, which I think just, I thought this was a rather nice example of basically a prehistoric monument being used in the modern day and a modern form of deposition attributed to this. And what I want to get at with these, by over-elaborating all these different forms of deposition, is that they are all socially constructed. There is always an aspect of performance involved. There's always an aspect of selectivity. Even where the fragments don't matter at the end of it, the way that those fragments were produced is important. And if we start from the premise that what we're seeing with the destruction and deposition of metalwork is a social action, what can we then contribute, what can we build towards in terms of depositing it and understanding why certain objects were deposited? And it's this approach from the action and the process point of view that I think differentiates what I'll be talking about today from previous approaches. Because things like social actions, social performances, they're linked to the construction of an identity. They're a way of people affirming who they are and their place in the world. And it's particularly important that these things are considered, we're able to get at these things in the past through the interactions with the material world that we can see. And this link with performance is a particularly striking one, I think. So the question is, how can we observe this in the past, in the Bronze Age and in other periods of depositional practices? It becomes fairly easy when we're dealing with burials. We're fairly familiar with the idea of seeing a body with a set of grave goods and building up the idea that they are a warrior, or that they are a craftsperson, or any number of interpretations. And of course, we increasingly recognise that it's nowhere near as simplistic as that. It's much more diverse. People don't just have one identity, you're also reflecting the identities of the people doing the burial as well. But of course, we have a context in which to work from there, and a practice that we can get our heads around. From a slightly more abstract perspective, we can think about ideas such as enchainment. This is a theory put forward by John Chapman, where he was doing studies of fragmentary and complete artefacts in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic of Southeast Europe. And he observed multiple broken figurines, bits of pot, stone tools, and copper objects that were in two halves, but buried in two related features, and even across different settlements. And he suggested that these objects were deliberately broken by people to enchain that social relationship, and people remembered the fact that these objects once joined together and were deposited in two areas in very similar ways, and this was part of tethering people together across time and space. In Britain, it's safe to say we don't have very many examples of this, and so it's much harder to get at this idea of enchained social relationships through fragments, though I'm aware of just a couple of examples. One that's on the screen here is two fragments of an axe mould, probably broken through use, but buried beneath the hearth of two adjacent houses, and they refit perfectly, and we can think about what the production of metalwork might have meant to a community. These stone moulds take up to 30 hours to produce. You can fully imagine them being an integral part of society, and when one broke, you could enchain relationships through those who used them. When we get to hoards, and things get a little bit more fuzzy, we often don't have good contexts for many of them. We're particularly lucky with the Havering hoard in the top left, that this was excavated under archaeological circumstances. And we found they found four hoards deposited in 4 pits within an enclosure ditch. But the further back in time we go, the fuzzier it gets. Down at the bottom left, we have 5 as-cast pow staves from the Middle Bronze Age. This is all that survives of the hoard. There were another 5 that were distributed amongst workmen. And from right here in Edinburgh, we have the Duddingston Lock assemblage of burnt and broken weapons that were found while dredging for shell marl in the 1700s. So by the time we get to single fragments of things, people generally reduce the interpretations down to scrap. This is a selection of stuff that is found by metal detectors on pretty much a daily basis, reported to the Treasure Trove Unit in Scotland and the Portable Antiquities Scheme in England and Wales, and we now know that there are thousands of these things. These are the things that people used to find and throw away because they weren't archaeologically pretty or special. And yet they wholesale are just used as plots on maps. They're just contributing to the distribution of this type of axe head or this type of spear. And it was all of these factors combined that made me really want to engage with what can we say about particularly these sorts of fragments, but also hoards and deposits more generally. And one of the ways I sought to undertake this was through a series of archaeological experiments where I worked with a bronze caster, Neil Burridge, to produce a series of replicas that I then tested different ways that you would break and smash up these things. I knew from various conversations with metal workers that the moment I said, "Could you snap this over your knee?" they went, nonsense. They told me straight up that the best way to do this is to heat up your objects and then hit them with a hammer. So that's what I did, and I'll show you a short video now. This is a sword that's been heated up to about 500 or 600 degrees, and this is me trying to control the size of the fragment produced using a hammer and chisel. You can see I'm not a metal worker, it's a more skilled person would do this much better, and it's actually easier just to hit the thing rather than fanning around with tools. And if you overheat the metal, it becomes very, very brittle and will explode on impact, as I found the hard way. Yes, fortunately, health and safety have not seen these videos because they probably wouldn't have let me do it otherwise. These are the resulting fragments from these experiments. Anyone who's had to work with bits of bronze from particularly the late Bronze Age will hopefully recognise these things as quite familiar. I myself was pretty proud of these results, so proud in fact that the spearhead I got tattooed on myself. Itself an interesting form of deposition that I won't go into. But it was quite clear that heating and fragmenting these objects was by far the most effective means. They could be heated in a fire that would easily have been achievable in the Bronze Age, and resulted in very nice fragments. By comparison, hitting them while cold made me pull faces like this. You saw how easily the axe broke. This is the same axe, or rather another replica of an axe with exactly the same metallurgical composition after I've hammered it around 105 times. These things are sturdy. There is a lot of material science that I could go into, but you'll probably be pleased to hear that I'm not going to. Though I was, needless to say, I was pretty pleased with the results, especially when compared to the archaeological artefacts on which these objects were based. And we see here the replica sword, the replica spear up against the real things, and also fragments of axes, many of which are found every day by metal detectorists. That's the question I get asked the most. Why has the AHRC given me money to do this? It is a very expensive set of experiments just to smash things up. The main point, particularly in archaeological terms, is that we have the beginnings of a reference collection. We have something from which to start to build new interpretations. When we find fragments such as these coming up from scattered across fields, yes, okay, we might still interpret them as scrap, but we can also add something to their biography. We can say that these have passed through a fire at some point, which means that they required someone with knowledge of building a fire, someone who understood the material that they were working with. Certainly much of what I undertook was heavily influenced by metalworkers, not by archaeological theorists. The people who work with these materials talk about the sensory aspects of doing this. They know how the material is going to behave, and when we find things like this, we can start to unpick some of those ideas and build up those narratives. We can say that they're more than just scrap. And by the time we get to hoards, this is just a small sample of a hoard, we can start to think about the selective practices that must have gone into this. If we're recognizing that some of the objects went through heated fragmentation prior to deposition, what does it mean about the objects that are complete in these hoards, the ones that are used, the ones that are unused? How can we get at the accumulation practices? Are we looking at not a static deposit, but something that was added to and taken away from over long periods of time, or something that was brought together by people with a range of different ideas, and where it was appropriate to treat some objects in some ways and other objects in other ways? And one of the best examples for exploring this, I think, is drawing on my PhD work, is this hoard from Somerset called the Sturgsey or Wick Park hoard. It's It's a collection of objects including axes, spears, swords, and fragments of ingot. It's by far the largest hoard in southwest England at 150 objects. It's 3 times larger than the next largest hoard. It has used and unused objects, complete, incomplete objects, and the traditional approach to this hoard is that it's a pile of scrap, comparable with the sorts of hoards such as the Havering hoard that I showed at the beginning. My research into this, I think, shows that it's a little bit more complex than that. For those of you who are typologically minded or over-obsessive over such things, the range of axes in the hoard can broadly be described as eclectic. They seem to originate, or the styles of them seem to originate from all across Britain, the majority of them being typical of South Wales, but we've also got examples more typical from Eastern England and even as far north as Yorkshire. And what's quite interesting about these axes are that these are the only complete ones in the hoard. Every other axe is smashed up in some way. You have to accept that some of the fragments may have belonged to these more super-regional examples, but I think it's quite telling that these fairly distinctive forms of axe heads that have these long-ranging connections have been treated differently to the rest of the material. And in fact, when we cross the Bristol Channel from Sturgsey into South Wales, we find that there's quite a range of hoards that are of very similar characters. As again, you've got hoards that have mostly incomplete bits of swords, spearheads, casting waste, but also a selection of complete axes of very specific styles. Likewise, likewise here from Menorbia in Pembrokeshire and Llantilio Crossenni, where some of the smaller objects in the hoards also represent continental connections from northwestern France, as well as other parts of Britain. And it's suggestive not only of the spread of depositional practices, but also the accumulation of material from further away, for whatever reason. So when we see something like the Sturgsey hoard, we can start to think about it in terms of the mixture of objects, the mixture of practices that have been undertaken. Some work that's been done on hoards from the Netherlands has similarly tried to identify these interregional, supra-regional connections, suggesting that we might term these hoards mixed origins. I would also suggest that we're looking at mixed practices as well, where certain objects are treated in certain ways. And could we here be thinking about an accumulation of objects that's about an expression of links with other places? So not thinking about it purely as a functionalist or a votive offering, but something that was done according to how people thought hoards should be done, and potentially something that's quite an active deposition with people adding and removing objects over long periods of time. Turning to a slightly different type of hoard, here we have 3 spearheads. There were originally 4, but one's gone missing, and a couple of spear ferrules, the bit that sits on the end of a spear shaft, buried in all deliberately broken, buried in a bog called the Bloody Pool in South Dartmoor. Originally attributed a Viking legend of marauders coming into Dartmoor and slaying people in a bog, and the bog waters ran red with their blood. But actually a Bronze Age hoard, nothing to do with the Vikings, and it catches my attention because everything in it is deliberately fragmented. I show here again the comparison between the replica example and the archaeological specimen. The replica experimental work demonstrated that these were probably if not definitely, deliberately heated and broken in this way. And the fact that this was recovered from a bog starts to evoke ideas of hot metal being thrown into cold waters and a hiss of steam, and this imaginative idea of a performance attributed to these sorts of things. Much like the Sturgsey hoard, this is a hoard completely out of place in southwest England. It is the only hoard of purely of weapons that was deposited at this time, and there's certainly no other hoard like it from Devon or indeed Cornwall, Dorset or Somerset. In fact, you have to go 160 miles east before you come across the Blackmore hoard. I show a small portion of it on the left there, but again, fragments of spears, bits of broken weapons, and also here a hoard from Shropshire. And what we can start to see is that the deliberate destruction of weapons, and in both of these cases the deposition in water, is part of a wider practice that's happening in Britain at this time. The dates we're talking about are around 1000 to 900 BC. It's a fairly narrow window that these objects date to, within 100 years. So we're talking just a couple of generations over which people felt it appropriate to deliberately break and deposit weapons like this. And Scotland was no exception. We have here 3 weapon hoards, the only 3 so far known from Scotland. By weapon hoards, I mean composing solely of spears and swords rather than axes and ingots and so on. But we see from the Isle of Coll in Argyll and Bute a selection of objects probably deposited over a series of depositional events. The Peel Hill hoard from South Lanarkshire, the largest weapon hoard in Scotland, comprising fragments of up to I think 40 spearheads off the top of my head, and I've already mentioned the hoard of weapons from Duddingston Lock, which all show signs of deliberate destruction to the point of warping and causing the metal to bubble. This means that they were being subjected to extremely high temperatures, and this accumulation of so many weapons certainly suggests aspects of performance and a concerted effort to gather material in a certain place and a shared idea of how it should all be treated. So I would argue that what we see with the Bloody Pool hoard is part of a shared ideology. It doesn't matter that there's a great geographic separation between examples of this sort of practice. There's an idea about how these things should be treated when you gather them together. It's important that they are deliberately broken. It's important that they're thrown into water. These have traditionally been seen as a votive deposit, much like the other weapons, though the Dunstan Lock example was first attributed a scrap function, a scrap interpretation, and so was the Bloody Pool hoard. But if we think about this as an event where they are deliberately decommissioning weapons before they're burying them, what does that tell us about the society? What does that say about who needed to be involved? You needed someone who understood how this material was going to behave. You also needed a community that understood how these things should be done. David Fontaine has recently written about hoarding and described it as the right way to act. There were many different ways of expressing this. So you might see the same types of weapons, but hoards are of variable scales, from the very small 4 or 5 objects to the Peel Hills containing 40 or 50. But everyone subscribed to this right way to act, and there was a right way to deposit things, but one that could be taken and done individually within a community. The final case study I want to talk about today is not a hoard at all, but something that shows the importance of understanding the context in which these objects were deposited. This is the South Cadbury shield. It is a Middle Bronze Age shield buried in an enclosure from Somerset on the brink of the rather more famous Iron Age and Roman hill fort at Cadbury Castle, written up by Leslie Alcock. And you can see it sits right there, and this is where the corner of the enclosure from which the shield was found. And importantly, this was excavated in archaeological circumstances. We know an awful lot about the how this shield was deposited, and when we start to go through, as I go through this, you'll see the range of interpretations that we can start to draw about the importance of this shield to the community that was depositing it. The first thing I want to flag up is that these are not easy things to make. These shields date to around 1400 to 1200 BC. During the Middle Bronze Age, shields have a fairly bronze shields have a fairly long life, but this specific type of shield, named after a deposit in Scotland from Yetholm, are known as Yetholm shields and characterised by these concentric circles of ribs and bosses, and I'll show a better picture in a minute. But importantly, they are hammered out from a single ingot of bronze, and in places they are less than a millimetre thin. They are not for the faint of heart. And you can see here the various individual bosses that have been hammered in. This is an example from Beath in South Ayrshire, and it's estimated that it could have taken a skilled metal worker anywhere between 1 and 3 months. The only replica that's ever been attempted by Neil Burridge, the bronze caster who made my replicas. He had to take regular breaks because of the sheer strain on his arm of trying to make even a simple version of these things. It really was an incredibly skilled undertaking when these things were deposited, when these things were produced, And the South Cadbury shield, although not in such a shiny state as the Scottish examples, consists of 25 concentric ribs and 25 concentric circles of bosses. There are 6,030 bosses that have been hammered into it. I did not count them. I left that to someone far more neurotic than I. But they have all been individually hammered, and they show aspects of where the maker made mistakes, where he or she hammered a bit too far through and snapped the bronze. But it also shows the level of care that was undertaken. There's a handle that was riveted onto it, but overall the object shows limited signs of use, corrosion permitting. And again, we see the sorts of objects that came up from Scotland. They're usually associated with fairly unique depositional practices. So Yetholm is one of 3 shields that you can see on display downstairs in the Early People Gallery. And the Beath shield is the only one surviving of 5 or 6 that were deposited in a bog, and importantly, they were deposited upright in a circle in the bog. Again, these are objects that are traditionally associated with more watery contexts. They usually come from things like bogs or lakes. And that's quite an important point, because the South Cadbury shield, until last year, was the only one known from a dry land context. Certainly, it was the only one of its kind known from a settlement enclosure. And when it was deposited, it was buried boss side down and stabbed through 3 times in situ. And we know that it was done in situ because the excavators were able to find fragments of bronze that were carried through at the puncture points into the soil below. And some of the damage on the Beath shield, and some of it is use related, some of it is corrosion related, but I was lucky enough to have a look at it just a couple of weeks ago and identify another a stab mark, which is almost certainly deliberate. And we can tell this from the fact that it's been punched through from the inside out rather than from the outside in. So this idea of puncturing shields is quite a dramatic thing, and even more so when we consider how laborious it is to produce one of these things. As I said, the context of the South Cadbury shield is relatively well known, and I'm going to show that now through a series of crude depictions that I've constructed using all of my PowerPoint skills. We know that the shield was deposited in a ditch. It was the final phase of the ditch infilling, but there was a post hole beneath the shield that had been dug, and the shield set into it. So we know that ditch was dug. We know that if it was buried over a post hole, that either the post hole was the post was removed from the post hole prior to deposition, or a post hole was purposefully dug as a place for the shield to be deposited. We also know that beneath the shield there was a red deer or cattle hip bone that was placed beneath the shield. So we also know that at some point an animal must have been killed or partitioned, and then this bone was inserted into the post hole, and then the South Cadbury shield was laid over this. And importantly, the shield boss was in direct contact with this bone, which I'll come back to later. We then know that the shield was stabbed through 3 times from behind in situ, and the excavators posit that this was done with a blunt, perhaps wooden instrument. As I say, these things are quite thin, and certainly if you're holding it static with enough force, you know that it we can speculate that it would have gone through quite easily, though this is one experiment I have not done yet, and perhaps never will. As I said, the shield was in direct contact with the hip bone that was beneath the shield, and radiocarbon dating of this bone produced a date of 1050 to 830 Cal BC. Importantly, the shield style and the compositional properties of the shield suggest a slightly earlier date for this shield. To make this a bit simpler, the shield is produced around this sort of time, and the bone in which it's in contact dates to around this time. So we may be looking here at a shield that was retained in circulation for up to 200 years. Certainly it was produced with metal that was older. It may have been recycled metal, but with we can start to wonder whether it may have been some sort of heirloom within a community. These shields were incredibly difficult to make. This is the only shield found from a dryland context of its type, so it's been deposited in an unusual context, suggesting that people aren't understanding how these things should be deposited, and it's also the only shield of its kind known from southwest England. Again, a rare object coming in, perhaps as an import. I mentioned that there was quite a complex depositional sequence associated with the shield, and whilst I've tried to keep most of this lecture text light, you're going to have to indulge me because trying to keep this straight in my head always causes me problems. I mentioned that it was deposited in the final phase of ditch infilling. The ditches were dug over a series of about 400 or 500 years. You've got a Middle Bronze Age phase, a slightly earlier Late Bronze Age phase, and a slightly later Late Bronze Age phase. And so the enclosure went through multiple iterations, constructions, and various depositions were placed in these ditches at any one time. The shield was deposited in this southeastern corner, and associated, and so that situates you in terms of the shield deposition. If we go right back to the first phase of ditch construction, the first ditch cut through an early Bronze Age burial that seemed to have been forgotten about. There's no sign of a barrow or anything similar that would have covered this. It seems to have just been a loose kist. It's suspected that it may have been a coffin burial, but we're not quite sure. So this ditch cut through that burial, and importantly, this is an early Bronze Age burial being cut through by a Middle Bronze Age ditch. However, it's not quite as simple as that, because the early Bronze Age leg bone ends up in an associated post hole in the late Bronze Age phase, 1 metre to the left of the shield deposition, and it is packed. The post hole is packed with what is described as burnt blue stones. Again, we have this role of fire playing a part in fragmenting and fracturing stones as well as metal. Alongside these fairly unusual practices, we have repeated instances of animal bones being deposited in these ditches. I mean, this is fairly common prehistoric stuff. You take bits of animals and you bury them in ditches and pits and post holes and all sorts. Predominantly what you have is the jaws of cattle being buried in these ditches, but there's also signs that other weird and wonderful things were going on. So here you have the various cattle elements, and you've also got what's described as a scoop outside the enclosure lined with burnt red stones. The colours refer to the excavator's description, though this hasn't ever been fully published, and I've never quite gotten to the bottom of what a red stone or a blue stone is. But this scoop on the outside had a very charcoal-rich deposit covering it, as well as a single burnt flint, a bowl sherd, and a single cattle rib described as snapped into 2 roughly equal halves. You've got a huge mixture of practices going on, and this is the only corner of the enclosure that they excavated. They didn't ever excavate the whole thing, much to my disappointment. I often wonder if there's another shield waiting in the northwestern corner. But it begs the question, what on earth is going on at this site? And you can start to break down this kind of assemblage of practices by starting at the scale of thinking about the shield, its potential import or production by skilled people, the possible retention and care of this thing over a long period of time prior to deposition. But it must have circulated in a community where these various depositional practices were understood, and by the time the final phases of the ditches are dug and filled, you've got a whole series of events going on where people are collecting, selecting, fragmenting and burning not just bits of metal, or in this case a metal shield, but also stone objects, bits of animal, bits of pottery. And you can't help but feel that there's a performative aspect to all of these things in a way that you don't necessarily see in many contexts, but must have no doubt been there on a lot of sites. And I've suggested that we should be seeing this shield not as a ritual offering, but as something that's had a mnemonic significance to the community that was depositing it. The idea that this may have been an heirloom 200 years old when deposited means it would have been embedded in that community, it would have been a part of that society. The giving up of this shield would have been a significant occasion. The fact that it was done in such a public forum, such as a ditch of an enclosure where everyone could have seen it, and such a well-constructed depositional event, strongly suggests to me that this is part of a series of processes where a community was trying to control a narrative around this object and around their view of the world. And so when we think about being baffled by hoards like this, I don't think it's any wonder that we struggle to understand why, because there's clearly so many complex things going on with fragmenting, gathering, accumulating, depositing these objects. There's aspects of time and space and belief systems that people are engaging with. People are still people. They're still doing things for reasons that make sense to them, in the same way that we might find Banksy's picture in a 50 years' time and have no idea why it's only half shredded. So I conclude this presentation by saying we still don't know why, but I think by approaching this from a more practical point of view, thinking about how these deposits came about, we can start to move beyond the more votive versus function depositions that have dominated the narratives for the last 150 years. And thank you very much.